Hey guys, welcome to the Scholar Online YouTube channel, the channel that is all about learning. This week we're going to keep sort of pick up where we left off from the last video that we did where we were going through the OpenAI Assistance API. If you watched that video towards the end, you would have noticed that there were some sort of challenges that we had, and today I've got all the answers for you. So keep watching until the end, and we're of course going to add even more interesting content to what we did. We're going to build a real life working application. So I'm going to start the video by demonstrating to you what exactly we are going to build, and then I'm going to build it for you. So we're going to use the Assistant API within a Streamlit application where you can just enter the title, enter your first question, and we're going to run the assistant after uploading a document. So this is going to be working on the retrieval tool part of the assistant, and then it's going to go run in the background. It's going to do the threading, the running, the checking of the running status. I'm going to show you exactly how to do that, and then when the status is 100%, it's going to display for us the results over there. So of course, before I demonstrate to you how we built this application, or before I even demonstrate to you the actual application itself, let's get through the admin of this tutorial. So if you're watching this channel for the first time, welcome to Scholar Online Learning. And of course, remember to like this video that you're watching and leave us a comment, because it really helps us with the YouTube algorithms and all of that stuff. And if you go to the bottom of the video that you're watching and you just click on that description, you're going to find more information. So if you hear me say, I'm going to link it in the description below. That's where you're going to find all the useful links to everything that we're going through in this video. And of course, contact information and all of that, you will also find that in the description of the video that you're watching, and useful timestamps. So timestamps are really useful for navigating through parts of the video, and I see YouTube has sort of like updated it in a nice format with chapters, so you can see the different sections, so you can jump through the different parts of the video. You don't have to watch the entire video if it's a little bit too long for you. All right, so let's get through the demo. So this is a demo of what we're going to build, and then after I showed you the demo, then I'm going to build it with you. So we've got a PDF document, and by the way, you can upload as many documents as you like. I'm going to just upload one document for simplicity, but you can add up to 20 different documents for one assistant. All right, so we're going to enter the title of our assistant. Let's say we call it, I don't know, grade 12 religion, because the document that we are uploading is about religious studies in grade 12. I'll show you the document over here. Oh, I'll show it to you later. Then after we've done that, we are going to ask the first question. Because I'm running everything in the background, we sort of need a prompt or a question to get the assistant running so that we can get the responses. So I'm just going to ask, what is this document about? All right, so this is like, imagine your talk to PDF, but with OpenAI Assistant, you're no longer limited to PDF. You can upload any type of document, really, and then you can browse over here and add your document in there. So the document that I need to do is this religious studies from grade 12. And it's going to go ahead and upload. So what's happening right now is, in the background, it's taking all of that information and it's creating my assistant directly with OpenAI. And as soon as it creates the assistant, I'm going to get my assistant ID over there, my thread ID, and my run ID. So it immediately ran the assistant with the thread, with the files that was uploaded, and then it's now waiting to see the run status. So if you watched last week's video, remember about the run status. You need to sort of wait for the run status to be completed before you can see the messages. The messages are always there, but there will be the old messages until the status is complete. So if you haven't watched last week's video, go and watch it so you can understand what we're doing in this video. I'm going to try as much as possible to help you understand, but I can't always redo everything I've done, or else this video will just be another 2-hour long video. Now, the assistant has run, the status is complete, and you can see this is a question that I asked, what is this document about? And then the assistant response is there. The document appears to be a self-study guide developed by the Department of Education in collaboration with a lot of things. And then this is a study guide, and then it shows you what the document is about. All right. So obviously, once you have the run ID and the assistant ID, you can add this, and you can add more questions to that thread, and you can continue. But I'm going to show you exactly how to do all of this in this video. So stay tuned, and I think this is going to be an exciting tutorial, and at least give you a nice sort of like, inside view of really now putting the assistant code into practice. Okay, so let us start with the course notes. All right, so if you watched last week's video, you would have seen I went through these notes earlier on, so most of this is still accurate. There is some updates I've got. So if you haven't, just go watch last week's video. You're going to learn quite a bit. So a lot of what we did last week, the only thing that I would change here, for example, is we found the GPT-3.5 Turbo, even within my own personal work, doesn't work very well with assistants. It works, but not very well. And I would highly recommend you do not use this model going forward, right? Creating your thread pretty much remains the same. Running your assistant remains the same. Retrieving thread messages also pretty much remains the same. And finally, adding more threads to the message, okay? So, love the API. Compared to Completion's API, it's really more versatile. It's got more things, and I sort of suspect, OpenAI is going to move towards the Assistance API, and maybe further away from the completions, chat completions. That's just my thoughts. There's just a couple of things I wanted to just bring to your attention. Of course, GPT-3 doesn't work very well. Stick to GPT-4, and within your code, always keep in mind that the main difference between the Assistance API and the chat completion is that you have to continuously check the status of your run. So you have these sort of like, back and forth, so if you don't understand what I'm talking about, very high level for guys who didn't watch last week's video, the Assistance API is divided into different sections. You have the assistant, you have a thread, and then you have a run. Okay, the assistant is the main sort of bot or agent that is sort of working and with a specific purpose in mind, right? You give it a purpose, you give it a model, and you give it tools, right? So the tool that we're going to select for our tutorial today is going to be retrieval tool, which means we're going to give it some files, and it's going to work with the files to retrieve certain information, whether it's a question that we're asking, is going to work in that sense. All right. And then the thread is going to be like a conversation. So within the assistant, you can have multiple threads, multiple conversations. You can create one thread, two threads, as many threads as you like within the same assistant. So in one thread, you could be asking about, give me a summary of your information. The other thread, you could be asking questions. The other thread, you could be having a totally different conversation. These are different conversations within the assistant. But a thread is a list of messages that you give to the assistant. So, and the messages have two types. You have type number one, which is your assistant response, which is when the assistant gives you an answer. And then you have a message type two, which is a user message, like a prompt. So when you give it a prompt and you ask it a specific question, that is classified as a user message. And then when you ask that question, you then have to take that thread with the question that you're asking and then run it. So the run is a third part of the assistant where you sort of like process your thread. So when you process the thread, the assistant looks at the messages, it looks at the initial information that it has, it makes its own internal decision as an agent how to actually create the prompts and everything for completions so that it can generate an assistant message. An assistant message is therefore a response to your user message. And then after that, it will add that message to the list of thread messages. Then when you check the list of thread messages again, you will find it has been updated with a new message that comes from the response. That is if the run was successful. So when you do a run, it could fail, it could be successful, it could hang and wait for an input. There are different sort of levels of a running thread. So you have to consistently check that run to see what the status of the run is so that you can determine whether or not you can check your messages to see if there's a response or whether you need to do something more, or in some cases you need to actually rerun the thread if it failed, for example, right? So there are levels and steps. If you haven't watched last week's video, start with it and then come back, because this is as much explaining as I'm going to do with respect to the foundation of how the Assistance API work. Today's tutorial, we're going to focus on taking all of this and building it into a working application, okay? So we're going to build an assistant, we're going to build a thread, we're going to create a run, and then we're going to check the status of that run. And then if it's successful, then we're going to display our thread messages, which will now include the assistant's response if the run was successful. Okay, so that's all we're going to do today. And I just want to remind you the different run statuses. So once you run your assistant, it immediately goes in as a queued a status, because when you run it for the first time, it gets queued. This is if OpenAI has multiple threads that it needs to run, or multiple sort of like assistants. Maybe there's like 1 million requests, and yours is going to be queued in there with all the other ones. And once it's queued, and then it will be in progress. When it's in progress, that is when it's being processed, when it's being run by OpenAI. And that can take actually quite a while. It's not as, this is another thing that I've noticed with Assistants API, as opposed to like a chat completion where you used to get your response almost in a couple of seconds. Like if you sent a question, within like 10 seconds you would have a response back. With chat completion, with assistance, it takes a little bit longer. So when you're building applications, you need to consider to build all of that into your application, and also manage user expectations that when they ask a question to an assistant, they might not get a response within 10 seconds, because this run can take, I've given it 30 seconds to check, to continuously check, but sometimes it takes longer. I've seen it going into a second, 30 seconds, and taking closer to a minute before it sort of resolves. And then after it has resolved, and I think this also depends on how many documents and how much data you've given it, right? So if it has completed, it will go into one of these, right? It will either be completed or it will fail, right? Specifically because we're doing retrieval is not going to have a requires action. Requires action usually only gets activated if you're working with, like, the functions, for example, function calling, where it will maybe ask for a response or a function call or something like that. But in this specific case, after progress, I've only ever seen, with the retrieval, I've only ever seen completed or failed, right? Unless if you cancel the run yourself in the process, then you'll have canceled. So for now, we're going to be checking only for completed, because that means everything is successful, and yay, we can go and check for the assistance response. So we're going to be covering all of these in our code, and then if it failed, you need to rerun it, okay? Because if it failed, sometimes it fails for no reason, and then you rerun it, and then it runs successfully. I've seen that also a couple of times. This week I've been working with this API quite a bit, trying to work with client projects on this. Okay, so let's get into our code. I'm going to assume you have a little bit of knowledge with a basic Python programming, number one, because that's what we're going to use. You have a bit of knowledge with last week's code, so you understand the different functions that we wrote. So these functions that I'm talking about, I have screenshots of them in all the slides. I'm assuming you've looked at all of them. I'm going to really fly through all of these functions, and then I hope that you have a little bit of basic understanding with how Streamlit works. Streamlit is a web platform that works with Python, that is really created for data scientists to help visualize your data and create a web front end to your application. It's not really the type of app I would take into production, like this app that we're looking at over here. This Streamlit app, I stopped running it, so you see the error there, but it's not the type of app I would take into production, right? But it's a good app for testing your code, and at least testing the back end of your functionalities to make sure these functions run well while you're still streamlining them. So ideally, after I've done this, I would then take these functions, once I've gotten them right and I've gotten the loops the way I want them, and I understand how the back end works, I would take this and put it into a proper web framework like Flask or Django to build an actual production level type application. But Streamlit apps are very, very easy to set up, and very useful to just look at how everything, the data is working in the back end, so you can at least get your back end pashasha. And then once you're good with your back end, then you can then put that back end into like a proper front end sort of framework like Django, because I don't want to test all of this in a very heavy thing, in a very heavy Django app, and then I'm just testing. For now, I want to get my functions right. So these functions, remember, we worked with them last week. We have a function for creating an assistant, right? And I prefer, by the time you create your assistant, you've already uploaded your files. So what we actually do is that we start by uploading our files. Uploading a file is very, very simple. You just get a file location, you use this code to upload a file, and then in this specific case I remove the location when I'm done, because I don't want to have a clutter of files in there. And then we run the client, and then we upload the file. Once we get the file ID, this function returns a file ID. We enter that file ID into the assistant app, as a file ID. We give the assistant function a model. Like I said, we're going to be working with GPT-4 going forward. We give it a tool, which is retrieval in our case. And by the way, this is a list, you can add multiple tools. You can work with retrieval functions and in one assistant if you want it. So for now, we're going to just stick with retrieval, and we're given it very basic instructions. You are a helpful assistant. Use a knowledge base to answer questions. Very, very simple. We're not going to complicate our assistant, and then we're going to do, we're going to create our assistant immediately over there, right? If you want a more deep explanation, watch last week's video, right? Once we've created our assistant, we're going to create a prompt, right? To create a prompt, and all of this is also available, by the way, in the assistant API documentation. And last week, I think I went through a lot of this in detail. So you'll see in the assistant, if you go to, I'll put this in the description of the video, but if you go to how assistant, see, they've updated this again. Okay. Okay, they've updated this since the last time I looked. They changed, this documentation is so flux, it changes so much. Yeah, it's, you have to check it up every day. So you'll see this code that I'm writing for creating an assistant over there. Assistant beta, create, adding the file ID, the tools, the model, the description, the name. You'll see this is the code that's here. All right. So I'm taking this straight from the documentation. All right, so if you read the documentation, you would see exactly where I'm getting this code for creating an assistant, right? And after creating an assistant, then you go into creating a thread, right? So then you go to create a thread, you need to enter just the messages within the thread. Okay, you could actually like create multiple messages, but for now we're gonna do only a user message, which would be like our initial prompt. All right, so our initial prompt, or the first question we are asking it, you need to sort of give it something to work with within your thread. You can't create an empty thread, right? Otherwise you won't be able to run it. So within a specific case, I'm gonna create a thread, and I'm gonna enter a prompt, which is my first question to the assistant, and then it will just give me a thread ID. When you create a thread, nothing happens. It just goes and puts all of this into a thread object within OpenAI. You then need to go the next step and run that thread. All right, so you need to run the thread you've created with the assistant. And to run a thread, you give it that thread ID that you got from creating the thread, which means you can actually run a specific thread with multiple assistants, right? It just hit me while I was working with this. I could create threads and I could run it with different assistants. So you could test different assistant settings, for example, even different assistant tools, and you could actually enter multiple threads into multiple assistants, which is amazing, because then you could sort of like do sensitivity analysis with respect to how you're defining your assistants to see what gives you better results. This is why I would want to test all of this in a Streamlit app, which is easy to look at. And then once I've gotten my ideal configuration of a thread and assistant, even the prompting, whether you put, and I've tested this of putting a prompt inside of your assistant and making a detailed prompt in your assistant, and then making a detailed prompt in your thread, right? In your thread, because over here where you see the prompt, this prompt can actually be a detailed instruction, right? Where you give your assistant even an example of how you want your answer to look like and things like that. And I've seen completely different responses. I've seen that the assistant actually works better. The assistant actually produces better results if I define the details of a user, what you call it, like a system, what we used to call a system message before. If you define that better in the messages of your thread itself, I found that the assistant actually performs better than if you try to over define what you want on the assistant level. So those are the kind of things you can test for when you're playing around with your assistant and see where the prompt works better. All right, so here you would then define your thread, and then here you would run your assistant with your thread ID and your assistant ID. Remember, the assistant ID, you get that back when you create your assistant. At the top, it returns an assistant ID, okay? And then you need that assistant ID over there to run your thread with the thread ID, which you get when you create your thread. All right, then once you've done that, then you need to check the status of your run, and you just need the run itself, which you get from this run assistant. You're going to check that run ID and the thread ID from the thread creation, and then you check the status. And then the status is one of those. Initially, it will be, queued and so forth and so forth. You check your status, and then once your status is completed, you will know that your messages have been updated with the new assistant message, and then you can go and retrieve your thread, okay? So if I go back into my notes, and I have a look at what I've updated over there. I've updated the code as well for retrieving the thread messages. This is once you've had a successful run. Okay, you can then call the thread ID, use the thread ID to actually list the messages within that thread, and then you will see the messages data, and then you can display them how you want. And for me, I found that it helps to invert the messages. This just inverts the messages so that I can see the assistant message last, but this depends on what order you want. You can leave it like that. That doesn't really matter. And then you can see the messages, okay? So that covers what the code looks like, all right? I will see if I can't create a gist or something and upload this code for you, right? I think there's no harm in that. I'll try and create a gist in the description of the video and upload these, so that you can see, so that at least you can work off my specific code, and then you don't have to worry about what I've written in here. All right. So with that done, we can get started with our Streamlit application. Okay, now we're going into Streamlit coding, right? What is Streamlit? Let's just have a look here at Streamlit. All right. Streamlit is very, very like this. Out of all the Python sort of web frameworks, is the most simplified way to get anything working. You can just create a Streamlit app and say create a Streamlit app as ST, and then you can write, and then it will write whatever it is that you want. You see everything, the way it's displaying it here is exactly what you need to do. You just start by creating the Streamlit app, and then you write what you want, okay? So the first thing that we need to do for our Streamlit application, if you can see, we need to write a title of the app, which we're going to call it Scholar Online. And then we need to write this little description so people know what's going on. And then we're going to write 2 input boxes. So there's an input box which you enter the title, and then there's an input box for the first assistant question. So we're asking it for a title and a question. And then after that, we're going to enter a file input where you can enter files in here. And then from here, this is all the information that we need. We're going to take that file input and immediately create our assistant with a title. And then after we've done that, we're going to use this to create the thread. And then you'll see it's going to be amazing. So let's look at our Streamlit code. And I've written it all here. I don't know if I should simplify this and create a new file so that we can start from scratch. So I can go through it step by step. All right. So let me call this appx.py. Right? No, actually, no. Let's create a file that we call appx.py. New file, appx.py, like that. All right. And then the first thing that we need to do is let's just load Streamlit. All right. Like that. And then we need to just load the title. This just sort of creates the title of our application like that, right? So we're going to call our app Scholar Online Assistant. My name is Karabo, your personal assistant, like that. And then after that, we can just run our Streamlit app, okay? Like that. All right. So this should just be very, very basic, a title, a description. It will just show all of that, and you can just see how easy it is to just create a Streamlit application. Now I'm going to run it in here, and I'm going to create a file that I'm going to call appx.py, and I'm going to just paste all of this in there, right? So this is just creating a very blank page. And after we've done that, we're just going to go in here, and we're going to say Streamlit. To run your application, you just basically say Streamlit run appx.py, just like that. And then it will run this application I think Streamlit uses port 8501. So if you just then click and copy this whole URL that it gives you over there, you can actually come here and paste it and run it, and then you can see the basic app that you've just built. Okay, so this is how easy it is. We have a title over there, and we have a description of our assistant, and it's already a working, what's going on? It's already a working Streamlit application where you can rerun and do all sorts of other things and stuff like that, right? But of course, like I said, we want to actually add an input box for taking in the title and taking in the these ones, right? So this is input boxes, right? So this field, this takes in the title, right? Where the title of the, what is it, the label of the input box is going to be enter title, right? This takes in the first prompt message, right? And then we have a file input that says choose a file, for creating an assistant. All right, so if we run this, right, you'll be able to see, let's just stop running it over here. All right, let's remove the original file that was there, and let's add it in again, and let's paste. All right, if we then run this file and we say Streamlit run appx.py, with all the changes that we've done, right, and you just refresh it, it will say error because we stopped running it at some point and it lost connection. You can see simply we already have our title, right? This is the title of the assistant. This is the assistant's first question, which is the prompt that we're going to take, and then this is the image. Remember, this is everything we need to create, run the assistant, and be able to display the response. So this is all the input we're going to get from the user. And let's remind ourselves what we're going to do with this input. The title of the assistant, we're going to use over here on our files to create the assistant. So the title of the assistant is going to go into the create assistant function. So the create assistant function takes in a title, and then it takes in file IDs, which means we need to actually process these files before we create our assistant. And to do that, we're going to need this function that processes the files. And this function is going to take in the location of the file where the file has been saved. All right, it's going to take in this location, and then it's going to open that location, and then it's going to upload the file into OpenAI, and then it's going to return a file ID. We're going to take that file ID, and then we're going to enter it into our create assistant file, and then we're going to create our assistant. So we will have the title, which comes over there. The instructions, we're going to decide what we want for the instructions. We can define them inside of the function, or you could even define them inside of a settings or a config file if you want, and then you could call it via config so that you can keep your instructions in one place. Probably a good idea. And the model as well, so that you can manage all of these inside of your config file. Typically I would do that if it was my production app, but because this is very simplistic, we're going to just leave it in there, and the model and everything, right? So with Streamlit, what's really important as well is you don't want to process these things if these are empty strings or nobody uploaded anything, right? So the way Streamlit works is that this uploaded file already is going to contain the file information of what you've uploaded in here. And this initiation is going to contain the string of what's entered in there and the title and so forth. So this title is equals to request and input, this initiation, request and input, and so forth. So once these information has been entered in there and in these input fields, which is what you see over there, they will be saved under these variables, and then we can then go and check that these variables are not empty, or they are not none, or that they have something in them, and then we can start to process them. So you'll see I've already written the code in here. I don't want to overthink this. I'm going to just copy this bit over there, and then I'll just explain to you what it does. All right, so what's happening in here is that we sort of say if the file is uploaded, so if uploaded file is going to check that something has been uploaded and it's not none, whatever has been uploaded is not an empty file, right? and the title exists and the initiation exists. It's important to do this check so you don't get errors. So for example, somebody entered a title and uploaded a file but didn't enter a question over there, this function is not going to run. Okay, because we need all of these things to be there for the function to run. So what we do is we just sort of like get value of this uploaded file, and then we create a location, whatever we want to call this file. You could call this file anything. Let's call this file our assistant file that to upload our assistant file upload. We're going to do that, and then we're going to say with open that location as a file, and then we're going to write the bytes data, which is the information that is the value from this uploaded file, a variable. So now we have uploaded this, and this now sits in this location. We have a location of an uploaded file, which is what we need to feed into our OpenAI. So what we do is that we're going to use a spinner to help our users understand something is happening now. We are now ready to create our assistant. We have our file location. If you remember, this is the location that we need over there to create the thing, and then we'll immediately get our ID, which we put back in there with the title. All right. So now what we do is we get our file ID using that thing with the location. That function is the function over there. You'll ask, where is it coming from? In here, inside of this file, we need to import it at the top over there. So if you look at app.py there, I'm just going to import it at the top there. So it says from assistant import, which means you need to have a file called assistant in the same location or in the same sort of place where your appx.py is running, and inside of this file is where I've defined my function. So these functions are defined in a separate file. You could have defined them in this file, maybe at the top there. If you wanted, you could have written them in here, but it will clutter this file. And just to separate the files, I've defined them in a different file, and then at the top I just sort of import. I say from assistant import everything. This wildcard imports all the functions that are in here. The danger of doing this way as well is that it imports including OpenAI and config and OS. So you must use this very carefully. This import wildcard is a dangerous thing to do. Your file, your especially if you do it all over your application, it can get mangled with things being imported everywhere. So ideally what you really want and what is good practice is to say import this, import that. So you could list everything you want to import and import them one by one. All right, that is the better practice of how to do this instead of importing a wildcard, because then it imports including the OpenAI is imported. If you actually wanted to refer to the OpenAI here, you could, but that's bad practice. So I'm doing something which I do not recommend you should do. So then we need to then feed the file IDs into the create assistant file, and you'll see I'm adding them as there's something I'm doing here. Just pay attention. So what gets created here is one file ID because I'm creating one file. If you had multiple files, you might loop over them to create multiple file IDs, right? And then after that, you need then the file IDs variable is actually it's got an S at the end. It just denotes there's multiple file IDs. And for that, I have now added that file ID into a list. Because it's just one file in my use case, I have just that one file in a list of files. So this variable is different from that variable. This variable is just a string of one file ID. This file IDs is actually a list of that one file ID, but you could have had multiple file IDs in here. So this is where, if, for example, you have 3 or 4 different files, up to 20 files you can add, and then you could have multiple file IDs inside that list. And the list is what you need to feed into the create assistant function. If you look over there, the create assistant.py function over here, this file IDs, it takes in a list of file IDs. Even if you go back to the documentation over there at the top where we are creating the assistant, you will see that this file ID is a list of file.id variables, which is a list of file IDs. All right, so that's what we're doing over there, and then after here we will have the assistant ID. So within Streamlit, you can save this assistant ID into a we can save it into a state variable so that it's remembered by the state of the application, right? But it's also not really that important. Actually, we are doing that over here. All right, so we could save it into a state variable. All right. And then we also then just sort of like display it. All right. So over here, write the file ID. So when the spinner finish running, it will display the file ID. All right. So let's then just copy that and paste that in there. So what this does is once the assistant this has finished running, it will display the assistant ID. All right. You can even say your assistant ID is whatever. All right. And it will display it as such. And then what happens over here is a couple of things. Here we are creating the thread. So immediately after we have the assistant ID, we're going to start creating our thread ID. And remember, for the thread ID, we only need that input message. Remember when we're creating our thread, if you look at the documentation for creating the thread, we only need that content user message, that first prompt, which is what we are asking for over here in our Streamlit egg. What is the first question that you have? So this first question is the one we're going to put into a messages object and create our very first thread. So that's what we're doing over here. So start assistant thread, if you look at our functions.py, is this function over there. It just takes in that prompt there, and then it creates the thread and it returns the thread ID. So then we've got the thread ID. So let's copy the thread ID. So that's what's happening here. All right. This is then we get our thread ID. Then after we have our thread ID, we're sort of saving it into the session because we're going to need it later to check the state and to retrieve the thread messages. Once we've done that, then we need to then immediately run the assistant. So we are now adding these functions one after the next, right? We've created our assistant, we've uploaded the file, we've created the thread, we've added, we've created the first question into the first thread, then we immediately run the assistant once we have that thread ID. And you can see the run assistant function over here. It takes in the thread ID. So you need to have created a thread first, and then it takes in the assistant ID. That's from the assistant we created over there. So it takes the thread and the assistant, it runs it together into a run function, and it returns a run ID. And this run ID function is the one we need to check the status of on a continuous basis. If the status is completed, we now know we can go and check the thread messages and check for the thread. So all of these, we are now adding the functions one after the other, right? So now we've run our assistant. We immediately run, where is it? So we run the assistant, we create the assistant thread, and then we immediately run the assistant using the thread ID that was created over there and the assistant ID that we got over there. So we're doing these functions one after the next, and at the same time, we are printing them out. So STWrite actually prints this to the front end. So you'll also be able to see what your thread ID is in the front end, and your run ID, you'll be able to see it. So after we run all of this, then we're going to check the status of our run. And we know the first time we check it, the status of our run is going to be ongoing or something like that, right? So we know the first time we run it, it's going to be something like ongoing. So this is where the tricky part comes in. All of this is pretty simple, very simple. We are uploading our file over there. We are creating our assistant with the file that we've uploaded, right? And then we're displaying our assistant ID. After we do that, we are then taking the initiation, which is the second variable that was entered there, the first question, and we create our first thread, and we display the thread ID, we add it to the session. After we've done that, we then run the assistant using the thread ID and the assistant ID, and we get a run ID. We then take that run ID and we check the status of the run, and we can even display the status of the run if we want, but there's no need to display it actually to the front end. All we need is to now wait. If the status is completed, we can immediately check our thread messages. But if the status is not completed, we actually need to wait. So we need to build in a loop inside of Streamlit that actually does a consistent loop checking the run status until the status is completed. If it's not completed, it waits and checks it again. If it has failed, actually what it needs to do is to rerun the thing and create a new run ID, right? But we're not going to check for failed. We're going to assume we're not going to fail because this is a very simple assistant, and I've tested it a couple of times without it ever failing. So I'm going to assume that we're not going to fail, but for robustness, you might want to actually check to rerun the thing if the status is failed. So you might want to check, for a failed status. All right. So what do we do over here? So once we've checked the status, I've already written the code over here. You'll see there's a bit of a loop, right? So what is happening over here? Let me actually just then copy the whole file, because now I've explained most of it. And actually, I don't need to copy it. I could just, yeah, let me just copy it so I have it twice. All right, so where I've explained everything up to this point, right? So what's happening here? What's happening here is that we check for the file status, all right? And if the status is not completed, so it could be anything that is not completed, right? We then put in a spinner that says, hey, we are waiting for the process to complete, so that the user knows we are waiting for the process to be complete, and then we wait for 30 seconds. Right, because the first time we check is not going to be completed, so time sleep 30 is a waiting. We wait for 30 seconds. In this 30 seconds, the spinner is running. While we're waiting for this 30 seconds, after 30 seconds, we check the status again. So this check run status is the same function as over there, right? And then now we enter the thread ID and the run ID again, right? So the second time we check it, the status could be anything. Maybe it's completed this time. We check it again if it's not completed. If it's still not completed, the spinner continues running and we wait another 30 seconds. So this function will just keep running, and every 30 seconds it will check the status. If it's not completed, it will run. This is a dangerous thing, because actually at this point we need to say if it's failed, for example, what we must do is rerun the thing. You know what I'm saying? So we need to probably rewrite this for that. But for now, I'm going to assume we're not reaching a failed state yet. So, but that is actually an update I need to make to this code, because we need to check if it's failed, right? We need to check if it's not completed and it is not failed. Because if it is failed, then we need to rerun it and update the state run ID into the new run ID of rerunning it. Because if it has failed, it's never going to change. It will remain failed until it expires or something like that, okay? So this is important that you do that, but for now I'm not going to do that. And then this loop will only exit once the status is completed. So it will keep looping until the status is completed, and it will wait 30 seconds and so forth and so forth. Now, when the status is completed, it will break out of this loop, and then we will now be able to retrieve the thread messages, right? So this retrieve thread messages is this function over here that retrieves the thread messages. You just basically enter the thread ID in there, and it gets all your messages. And then I list all my messages, and then I divide them according to content and role. So the content is going to be the message itself, and the role is going to be whether it's an assistant or a user. So I'll be able to check, if it's a user message, say it's a user message. If it's an assistant, say it's an assistant message, and then write the content. I've simplified this because normally sometimes it even returns remember what we did last week? We were able to see that it even returns it tells you where it got the information from, like a quote or what we call annotation of where it retrieved the message from, a reference, the actual document where it's referencing it from. So you can even get that to the annotation to actually display the reference. But for now, we're going to overly simplify, and we're not going to go into the annotation. We're not going to go into the reference. We're just going to look at the content and the row, and then we're going to invert the list of messages that we got from there. And then if you look over here, that is the list that we're now displaying, retrieve trade messages. And then we're going to go through the list and just if it's a user message, say user message. If it's a assistant message, say assistant message. And that's it. That's basically, this is less than 65 lines of code that we were able to create our Streamlit app, right? So you can actually just save all of this, right? I'm actually going to take all of this, run it. So stop running this, what we have over there. Paste that in there, and you've got your assistant running, right? So that's the next part of our video. Is I'm gonna then run this again, and before I run it, I just want to show you, this is my assistant. So all the assistants you create actually get if you go to your playground and I'll put this in the I'll put this link in the description. You'll see all your assistants and including the instructions and the assistant number and the date created. You'll see the last assistant I created was the 7th of December, right? So the assistant that I'm going to create today is not there yet, right? And when you create it, you can even interact with your assistants in the playground, right? So when this function finishes running, I should see a new assistant over there with a title that I've given it from my Streamlit application, right? So let's run our Streamlit app. Okay, now that the application is running, let's get into our Streamlit and let's just refresh the page. It will look the same pretty much, but there's logic now. So as soon as it will look the same as what we had before, but now after uploaded file, there's some logic that happens. So this logic is now been added in the background. You don't see it, but like let's create the assistant and see. So I'm going to upload this religious studies file. This is the file I'm going to upload, and it is a study guide as you saw in the intro video. So I'm going to call this religious study guide, and then the first question is, what are the key takeaways? The key takeaways from this document. Right, and then I'm going to immediately upload it, and immediately when I finish uploading, the work is going to start, because you'll see over here this function runs immediately the file is uploaded. So there's no like button that I need to press or anything like that. Okay, so if I go and I have a look for this, I think it's over here, religion sciences. So immediately when I finish uploading, the logic will start. It won't even like ask for anything, and immediately you can see it's processing your file and setting up the assistant. This is that initial processing your file and setting up the assistant. That's the initial code over there. When it finishes running, it will display these things, which are these things that it's displaying over there, and immediately checks for the status. So immediately the run has been created, the thread ID has been, so all of this is happening like boom, 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 one after the other. So this waiting for process to complete is this code over here that is running. So this code will keep running until the status is completed. So if it runs and 30 seconds later, the status is not completed, it will just loop again. You see, that's first loop. You see, did you notice that little bit of thing that happened over there? So the first time the status was not completed, 30 seconds, and then it checked it, and then it ran again, right? So now we are in the second loop, which means in this specific case, it's taking more than 30 seconds. If you notice this taking maybe more than 2 minutes, maybe you might want to consider adding the failed check in there, because sometimes the run actually fails, and even if the run fails, it will not pass this test. Okay, it ran this time. So but if the run failed, it will not pass this test. It will continue looping. So ideally, this is your homework. Do improve this code for me, and add an additional, check for what if the status failed. And if the status fails, actually what you want to do is to rerun. So this function over there, you want to redo it. You want to rerun it and update the run ID inside of your session state, and then continue the loop. Okay, so that's what you can do. But in this specific case, it ran twice, and in 1 minute it was finished running. 1 minute is still a long time, so I don't propose you use something like this for like a chatbot. But there we go. So the first user message was, what were the key takeaways? So when I say this retrieve thread messages, this user message that I created over there when I created the thread the first time, the one which came from the initiation, which was the input that you entered as your first question, is actually recorded as a thread message. So that's the first thread message that gets displayed, and it's a user type message. So when you created the thread the first time, this is the message we added, and then we ran the assistant with this message, and then the assistant ran. When it finished running, it then produced this assistant's response. And here's our assistant response. So my question was, what is the thread? What is the key takeaways? This document outlines various religious scientific views on the creation of the universe, and then Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Taoism, and Baha'i faith. And then you'll see over here it has a source. So when you see something like this, it means that inside of your annotations, you'll find the source of where exactly it found this this thing from. Okay, and we're gonna end our video over here, and before we do, I just want to show you inside of my assistant. Remember, this is where we were before. So if you actually click over there, you will see that there's a new assistant that wasn't there before, created right now today on the 10th of December. And if you click this assistant, you'll see over there, that's the retrieval assistant. This is the file that I added, so this is my file to work with. And you can even test this if you wanted. You could test this assistant on the playground. This assistant will produce the exact same results as it will produce over there, because it's exactly the same assistant. So this is really cool. This is something we didn't have with the chat completions, that you could see the same chat completion you're creating inside of the playground. So now you can, which also means that if you wanted, you could create your assistants in the playground. So all the coding that I did, I could create that assistant here. So under assistant there, I could create a new assistant, or I could create it over here. Instead of creating it programmatically the way I did it, I could create an assistant there and upload the file and everything, and that assistant would be there. And then I could get the assistant ID once I've created it, and then I could use this assistant ID and create a thread programmatically with that assistant ID. Or I could create a thread over here, get the thread ID, and then continue processing it via API. So the API and the playground are really, they sort of like intersect here. And what I find is useful is maybe going forward in future with more advanced, not advanced, but like if you don't need to create an assistant programmatically all the time, you could create it very carefully on the playground, and then programmatically you could be working with just adding messages to the thread. You know what I'm saying? So you could create an assistant here and then get the thread ID. And then when it comes to like now interacting with the assistant, that's when you now create a chatbot over here. So this chatbot doesn't start with creating the assistant. It just starts as a chatbot of an already created assistant, and then and thread, and you just sort of enter the thread and assistant there, and then you start just processing, because that would be the next step. What I would have done was, I would have like two windows here. The one window is for creating an assistant, and the next one is for interacting with that assistant, and picking which assistant, and maybe even adding more assistants manually and interacting with them. So maybe next week's tutorial, the next tutorial, we'll do that. We'll create like different pages to our app, and then the next page, because now there's no more interactions after here. I've created it, I have the first message in the first thread, but then what? You know what I'm saying? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually save this assistant ID and thread ID, because otherwise there's no way for me to recover the thread ID, even though I can recover the assistant ID from the background. So I'm going to save these. I'm going to save them even in here in case I forget which file to work with, because they're identical. All right. And then maybe next tutorial, we'll work with adding messages to the thread and rerunning it. And so maybe creating a chatbot now, a chatbot with an existing assistant that's already been created, right? And how to interact with it now over here. All right. And with that, I'm going to call it a day, guys. And thank you for watching our video. And we'll see you again next time when we build on this application to add even more features.